Settlement just highlights how much institutions are willing to pay to avoid corporate indictment. I think the settlement could have been a lot more if they hadn't opted for this sort of negotiate settlement, so to speak, because there was a hearing that was adjourned yesterday because they'd reached the agreement. But I think the bigger issue here for Standard Chartered is that it's potentially avoided, at least for now, losing its US banking license, which is quite significant. And I think when you look at the sort of approaches to regulation on both sides of the pond, there's a very different approach. A lot of the heat seems to be coming from the US and not necessarily from the British authorities, I think, which raise some very interesting issues.
Also, as well, I mean, what happened as far as Standard Chartered is concerned was going through its US operations, wasn't it? And I know that was the case with HSBC as well, with its probes into various areas. It was operations in Mexico and parts of the United States. Is that perhaps why we sort of see this, you know, this sort of area of angle going from the United States, do you believe, rather than the, you know, the Financial Services Authority in the UK? I think, or do you think we're just we're a lighter touch here?
Because if you look at the Librogate scandal going back a few weeks ago, and if you look at previous things as well, it seems like the US authorities have taken a more uncompromising approach. And of course, the penalties and the sort of criminal indictments for these sorts of corporate and financial crimes or issues are a lot more severe in the US. But having said that, it is pretty clear as an institution, if you're increasingly doing business in the US in a globalized world, a US embargo to Iran is obviously a potential reputational risk for any sort of business.
What you're saying, though, is you think UK regulators are a bit of a light touch? Is that
not necessarily? I think there's been a lot less clarity on this front when you see the approach of the FSA to some of the issues, banking sector scandals that we've seen, and it seems like the American counterparts have been one step ahead of the game in that regard.
Interesting.
I wonder if that will continue, actually. Let's move on to what's going on in Syria. We're obviously reporting Baroness Amos is there at the moment, desperately trying to make sure, protect some of the civilians that are being caught up in the crossfire, but still the international wrangling goes on. And the Gulf News saying that there's actually been phone calls being held between the various secretaries of state, obviously in the United States, and foreign secretaries as well. And I'm not sure, you tell me, are you feeling there's some momentum here?
I think we're reaching some sort of momentum, but, you know, one has to be cautiously optimistic. I mean, one of the most significant things that has happened over the last week is that one of the highest-ranking members, a former member of the Syrian regime, his prime minister, ex-prime minister Riyad
now in Jordan.
Yeah, now in Jordan, has come out to say that he believes the Assad regime is now only controlling about 30% of its territory or less. And I think certainly the diplomatic phone calls between the US Secretary of State and the French and others do suggest that we're reaching some sort of real potential breakthrough. The cautious optimism comes from the fact that recently you had Kofi Annan resign over what he saw as a lack of international unity. So time will tell. But I think there need to be lessons to be learned from what has happened in Egypt and Libya and how you build a post-Assad Syria and deal with all the sort of legacy issues that would have arisen from this conflict.
Now, the Guardian front page talking about Julian Assange, who is, of course, the head of WikiLeaks, and Ecuador's president has said, yes, we will grant him asylum. He's been kind of hiding out at their embassy for quite some time.
This according to The Guardian, because they've also tried to make clear that there is a meeting today as well, and that's no guarantee of asylum, so it's still quite a murky picture.
It's still unsure, but I think this is interesting because there's a sort of underlining theme going in, which is relations between the US and Ecuador. And this is a real test for that. There have been some diplomatic wrangling in the recent past. The Ecuadorian authorities recently sent home the US ambassador in that country. They also closed down a US military base. So it's quite an interesting one, but I think it raised all sorts of complications around international law. If he does seek asylum in Ecuador, how will he actually leave British territory and then get to Ecuador? So it's going to raise up a lot of legal uncertainties, I think. And I think relations between the US and Ecuador will probably deteriorate a bit further over this.
So keeping an eye on that. The Olympics now. I still feel good after the Olympics. I still have that feel-good factor. Yeah, how could you not? Hey. But still, tourism, not saying it's had too much of a benefit.
No medals for Jeremy Hunt from small businesses here because his sort of... I think for me, how do you actually quantify the economic impact of the Olympics? The effects and the impact have been uneven across the board, from small businesses to big businesses. I know we're all sort of in this Olympics hangover phase, but I think the real question is what the government will do with the legacy question from here on.
But when it comes to, like you say, how can you measure to what degree it's helped the economy or helped tourism? surely just the event itself and the PR of that event and the message it sent to the whole world in terms of tourism, in terms of promoting London and the rest of the UK, perhaps he's talking about that. You know, and it's not so much statistics. We won't have the statistics for months and months to come, will we?
Sally, it's been a fantastic rebranding for the UK as a whole in terms of perceptions globally across the board.
Visit UK has got to be given the biggest boost
Seriously,
ever,
and
surely.
I think we will see people coming to the UK, perhaps even for the first time, on the back of it having hosted the London 2012 Olympics. So I think only time will tell, but I think Jeremy Hunt will probably face a bit more of a raucous from businesses who feel that trade has slumped.
Well, we were just saying before we came on air that you travel in London and we were told it was going to be carnage, chaos in the city, and it wasn't. The trains
Absolutely.
were great.
I remember the trains being empty on the first working day after the opening ceremony, and that was quite surprising. I actually got a seat on the train.
Oh, well, miracles never cease. Let's talk about a clean-up plan for cosmetic surgery. Obviously, we've had the PIP implant scandal, and it's about time, actually, that this industry was addressed, because so many people were so shocked that the PIP scandal actually was able to happen.
I mean, this is the ugly face of cosmetic surgery, if you want. And I think what is interesting is that perhaps for the first time, it's actually being thought of in the same light of as mainstream health issues, which I think from a regulatory point of view is actually a very positive thing. I know there are people who will say that, well, those who go and do cosmetic surgery for aesthetic reasons as opposed to health reasons should probably be able to deal with the consequences. But I think this is a good move by the government, and it really boils down to a question of regulation.
Regardless of why they're going, needs to be properly regulated.
Absolutely, it needs to. Some of the products coming from other parts of the world need to be properly monitored and enforced and checked that they meet global standards.
Oh, one of the surprising things I was reading here is there aren't any minimum training requirements for surgeons.
No, and this is an interesting question, because the question is, there aren't. And is the onus on you as a potential patient for cosmetic surgery to check whether your consultant has these qualifications?
And another thing, actually, they were going to do is actually give people a cool-off period. So obviously, if you're thinking you want this done, hopefully people would have thought about this. But when they finally get there, not to just be blinded by the science of it all and how wonderful the miracle cure is going to be. Go back home, think about it, and understand what you're undertaking.
Absolutely.
Now, let's see if we can get a picture of this couple.
Adrian
and Gillian Bayford, who were the ones, they came out into the public and said, we have won £148.6 million, a monster jackpot.
Christmas has come early for the Bayfords. They are going public. I'm not sure I would do the same if it was me. I'd want to ensure that I now had enough money to ensure I could lead a quiet life.